England in the Norman and Angevin age was ruled by a warrior elite, yet daily life in the kingdom was often calmer than its reputation suggests. Full-scale fighting on English soil did happen, but it was not the normal rhythm of politics. Trouble flared along the frontiers, especially near Wales and across the northern border, and foreign landings were feared more often than they were seen. The heavier, more continuous wars were usually fought elsewhere, particularly in France, which meant the English population often felt conflict less through marching armies and more through the demands of money, supplies, and obligations. Still, the society remained built for war, fortifications dotted the landscape, and young nobles grew up trained for violence, even in years when the shires themselves were quiet. To understand how these conflicts were fought, we have to picture a world where most equipment has vanished, and where images and scattered records become our main guide. The typical mounted knight was protected by interlinked metal rings, with a hood of mail guarding the head and neck beneath a helmet. Shields were large and shaped to cover the body from horseback, and the main striking weapons were the lance and the sword. This was expensive power, not only because metalwork was costly, but because proper protection demanded skilled manufacture and constant upkeep. Not everyone could afford the fullest kit. Lighter forms of protection, including shorter mail garments and padded defences, were more common among lesser men. Over time, the look of the fighting man changed only gradually. Helmets evolved, shields shifted in shape, and heavier face-covering helms became more widespread later on. But the basic silhouette of the knight stayed recognisably similar across generations. Missile troops mattered throughout this period, and not only in famous set-piece battles. Archers could be raised in large numbers because their weapons were comparatively easier to supply, and they proved decisive in key moments from open battle to woodland harassment and ambush. Crossbows, by contrast, were specialist tools. They were slower to reload, but powerful, accurate and deadly, especially from walls, towers and protected positions. That made them a nightmare for attackers during sieges. Castles and towns were not just strong points, they were engines of war, and siege fighting often revolved around who could hold a position long enough to starve the other side, break morale, or create a breach. Engineers built towers, screens and platforms to dominate the walls, and garrisons answered with bolts that could turn a crowded assault into a slaughter. For most campaigns, the harsh reality was that war often meant destruction rather than heroic clashes. Raids, burnings, crop theft and livestock seizures were not random cruelty. They were a strategy. Devastating an enemy's land could deny supplies to invaders, feed one's own forces and pressure communities into submission. In civil conflicts, plunder became almost a habit, and even after peace settlements, armed men did not always stop simply because a treaty had been signed. Battles did occur, and when they did, they were risky gambles. Commanders sometimes chose to fight on foot to show commitment and prevent easy flight, turning heavily armoured men into anchors for a battle line. When an army broke, local people who had suffered under soldiers' demands could become vicious pursuers, hunting down defeated foreigners or raiders with the tools of farm life. All of this required manpower, and kings drew it from several streams. There were local levies and town forces, and in emergencies rulers called on all who could bear arms, using shame and status as pressure. More selective was the feudal system, where landholding carried defined military duties. Some lords met their quotas by settling knights on estates in return for service, while others commuted obligations into cash or supported a smaller number of men for longer campaigns. Service was not only about riding to war, it could include garrison duty in key castles and specialised roles like providing archers, crossbowmen, or support for supply trains. Alongside these feudal obligations stood the king's household troops, paid, trained fighters at the core of royal power, plus hired professionals who moved from war to war for wages. Regions with fewer opportunities supplied many of these men, and in long, grinding conflicts their experience could be as valuable as noble lineage. In the end, even when the kingdom itself seemed relatively peaceful, the machinery of war was always present, in fortresses, in obligations, in taxes, and in the steady expectation that sooner or later, trained fighters would be needed again. By the late 12th century, warfare in Western Europe had taken on a harsher and more professional edge. Princes no longer relied only on feudal obligations or household knights. Instead, they increasingly strengthened their armies with full-time fighters for hire. Among the most feared of these were bands of mercenaries known across Europe for their brutality and mobility. These men fought not for land or loyalty, but for pay, and their reputation spread far beyond the regions they came from. English kings were no exception in turning to such forces. When Henry II crossed from the continent to deal with rebellion at home, he was accompanied not only by mounted nobles but by large groups of hardened professionals. Similar troops were used in political arrests and internal power struggles, and their presence became so notorious that church councils openly condemned them by name. Contemporary observers describe them as men encased in iron and leather, carrying heavy weapons, moving from place to place like a storm. Wherever they went, villages burned, towns were looted, monasteries were violated, and the civilian population lived in fear. These soldiers saw war as a way of life and destruction as its natural language. At the same time, mercenaries were not limited to foreign professionals. The rugged landscapes of Wales produced tough infantrymen, accustomed to hardship and violence. They could be hired in large numbers and were repeatedly used by English kings in campaigns both at home and overseas. During major continental operations, Welsh troops were sent across the Channel in organised transports, sometimes alongside mounted men at arms. Their recruitment often rested on political ties between the English crown and native Welsh leaders, relationships that were reinforced through shared military service. Over time, the image of the Welsh soldier became a familiar feature of English armies, a reality later echoed in literature and drama. The boundaries between different kinds of soldiers were rarely clear. Men who began as hired fighters could become household retainers, and household knights often held land that obligated them to serve as feudal warriors as well. Loyalty, pay, obligation, and opportunity overlapped constantly. A knight might fight 1 year as part of a lord's personal following, and the next as a landholder answering a formal summons. Medieval warfare was not organised into neat categories. It was fluid, pragmatic, and driven by immediate need. This military world was shaped above all by castles. The arrival of the Normans brought a revolution in fortification. Before their conquest, England had relied largely on communal defences and wooden halls. The castle introduced a new logic of power. These were not meant to protect whole communities, but to dominate them. They were compact, elevated, and built around a central strongpoint that could resist attack even if the outer defences fell. Height was as important as thickness, and control of the surrounding land depended on visibility and intimidation as much as walls. Castles spread rapidly across the landscape. Hundreds were built within a few generations, many of them simple earthworks topped with timber towers. They did not require advanced engineering, only labour, which could be extracted from the very people they would later control. Over time, many of these early fortifications were reinforced with stone, transforming temporary structures into permanent symbols of authority. Others were abandoned, destroyed, or left unfinished, silent traces of failed ambitions or crushed rebellions. In some counties, castles appeared at striking density. Royal fortresses stood beside baronial ones, episcopal strongholds near private estates. Some guarded towns, others dominated rural manors. A few were massive and enduring, while many existed only briefly, their memory preserved only as grassy mounds. Yet even the smallest could disrupt an entire region when garrisoned by armed men. Control of castles meant control of war. Campaigns were shaped not by open battles, but by sieges, blockades, and the constant threat posed by garrisons. Castles could be ignored only at great risk. They could strike supply lines, shelter raiders, and serve as bases for terror. As a result, military effort focused again and again on taking, destroying, or neutralizing these strongpoints. Siege engines were dragged across the countryside, miners were employed to undermine walls, and elaborate devices were built to break defences that refused to yield. The civil conflicts of the early 12th century revealed the darker side of this castle-based world. During prolonged instability, castles became centres of extortion. Lords and their followers used them as instruments of private power, seizing people for ransom, stripping villages of livestock, and enforcing obedience through fear. By the late 12th century, warfare in Western Europe had taken on a harsher and more professional edge. Princes no longer relied only on feudal obligations or household knights. Instead, they increasingly strengthened their armies with full-time fighters for hire. Among the most feared of these were bands of mercenaries known across Europe for their brutality and mobility. These men fought not for land or loyalty, but for pay, and their reputation spread far beyond the regions they came from. English kings were no exception in turning to such forces. When Henry II crossed from the continent to deal with rebellion at home, he was accompanied not only by mounted nobles but by large groups of hardened professionals. Similar troops were used in political arrests and internal power struggles, and their presence became so notorious that church councils openly condemned them by name. Contemporary observers describe them as men encased in iron and leather, carrying heavy weapons, moving from place to place like a storm. Wherever they went, villages burned, towns were looted, monasteries were violated, and the civilian population lived in fear. These soldiers saw war as a way of life and destruction as its natural language. At the same time, mercenaries were not limited to foreign professionals. The rugged landscapes of Wales produced tough infantrymen, accustomed to hardship and violence. They could be hired in large numbers and were repeatedly used by English kings in campaigns both at home and overseas. During major continental operations, Welsh troops were sent across the Channel in organised transports, sometimes alongside mounted men at arms. Their recruitment often rested on political ties between the English crown and native Welsh leaders, relationships that were reinforced through shared military service. Over time, the image of the Welsh soldier became a familiar feature of English armies, a reality later echoed in literature and drama. The boundaries between different kinds of soldiers were rarely clear. Men who began as hired fighters could become household retainers, and household knights often held land that obligated them to serve as feudal warriors as well. Loyalty, pay, obligation, and opportunity overlapped constantly. A knight might fight 1 year as part of a lord's personal following, and the next as a landholder answering a formal summons. Medieval warfare was not organised into neat categories. It was fluid, pragmatic, and driven by immediate need. This military world was shaped above all by castles. The arrival of the Normans brought a revolution in fortification. Before their conquest, England had relied largely on communal defences and wooden halls. The castle introduced a new logic of power. These were not meant to protect whole communities, but to dominate them. They were compact, elevated, and built around a central strongpoint that could resist attack even if the outer defences fell. Height was as important as thickness, and control of the surrounding land depended on visibility and intimidation as much as walls. Castles spread rapidly across the landscape. Hundreds were built within a few generations, many of them simple earthworks topped with timber towers. They did not require advanced engineering, only labour, which could be extracted from the very people they would later control. Over time, many of these early fortifications were reinforced with stone, transforming temporary structures into permanent symbols of authority. Others were abandoned, destroyed, or left unfinished, silent traces of failed ambitions or crushed rebellions. In some counties, castles appeared at striking density. Royal fortresses stood beside baronial ones, episcopal strongholds near private estates, Some guarded towns, others dominated rural manors. A few were massive and enduring, while many existed only briefly, their memory preserved only as grassy mounds. Yet even the smallest could disrupt an entire region when garrisoned by armed men. Control of castles meant control of war. Campaigns were shaped not by open battles, but by sieges, blockades, and the constant threat posed by garrisons. Castles could be ignored only at great risk. They could strike supply lines, shelter raiders, and serve as bases for terror. As a result, military effort focused again and again on taking, destroying, or neutralizing these strongpoints. Siege engines were dragged across the countryside, miners were employed to undermine walls, and elaborate devices were built to break defences that refused to yield. The civil conflicts of the early 12th century revealed the darker side of this castle-based world. During prolonged instability, castles became centres of extortion. Lords and their followers used them as instruments of private power, seizing people for ransom, stripping villages of livestock, and enforcing obedience through fear. Contemporary writers describe a countryside where even the sight of armed riders sent entire communities fleeing. Authority fragmented, and many local strongmen ruled their surroundings like petty kings. These conditions explain why later rulers made it a priority to control castles directly. Unauthorized fortifications were destroyed, private strongholds were seized, and royal castles were expanded and reinforced at enormous cost. Over time, the balance shifted. Fewer nobles were allowed to maintain their own fortresses, while royal power became increasingly concentrated in a smaller number of heavily fortified sites. Castles were not simply military structures, they were statements. Their placement in towns reshaped urban life, sometimes at the cost of entire neighbourhoods. In the countryside, they marked centres of domination. In border regions, they formed defensive chains. In times of peace, they might be lightly staffed. In times of crisis, they became the pivots around which war revolved. At the end of the 11th century, observers were struck by the sheer richness of England's natural environment. The land appeared generous and productive, wide fields ready for cultivation, lush meadows, strong pasture, abundant livestock, energetic horses, clear streams, navigable rivers, fish-filled waters, and extensive woodland alive with game. To those arriving from abroad, England looked like a land exceptionally well suited to farming, settlement, and human life. Although landscapes are never truly static, some features change far more slowly than others. England's basic physical framework was already firmly established by the 12th century. It formed the greater part of a large island, surrounded by a long and broken coastline with many natural harbours. Its climate, though northerly in latitude, was softened by the surrounding seas, producing relatively mild conditions. Clear contrasts existed between the cooler, wetter north and west, and the warmer, drier south and east. These differences shaped patterns of settlement, farming, and land use long before modern times, and in an age when people had limited ability to control nature, their impact was even stronger. Yet medieval England was not identical to the country we know today. Climate itself was different. Evidence now suggests that the 12th century lay within a long phase of relatively warm conditions. Summers were generally warmer than those of later centuries, winters milder, and overall rainfall lower than during the colder period that followed in the later Middle Ages. This warmer climate allowed crops to be grown at higher altitudes and supported forms of agriculture that would later retreat. Vines could grow successfully in many parts of England, and wine production, while never dominant, was entirely viable. Farming settlements appeared in upland areas that would later be abandoned as conditions cooled. The shape of the land was also different. Coastlines had not yet settled into their modern form. In some regions, the sea advanced, swallowing villages and fields. In others, rivers deposited silt and slowly pushed the shoreline outward. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in the great wetlands of eastern England. Vast marshes and shallow waters dominated the landscape, leaving only narrow strips of habitable land between sea and bog. Many monasteries stood like islands amid water and reed. Although drainage had begun, most of this region remained unsuitable for permanent settlement. Even so, gradual encroachment continued, and land was slowly reclaimed from marsh and fen as pressure on resources increased. Population levels in medieval England cannot be measured precisely, but they can be estimated with reasonable confidence. Records from the late 11th century list households rather than individuals, so any calculation requires assumptions about family size and the number of people not formally recorded. When these factors are considered, England's population around the time of the Norman conquest likely exceeded 1.5 million, and may have been closer to 2 million. It almost certainly didn't fall below this level. What matters more than the exact number is the trend. All available evidence points to steady population growth throughout the 12th century. By the early 13th century, numbers had risen significantly. Records that count adult males show a sustained increase year after year, interrupted only briefly during periods of political unrest. Even so, growth quickly resumed. By the 1220s, the population was clearly much larger than it had been a century earlier. This expansion is also visible in the countryside itself. Manorial surveys from different dates show a striking rise in the number of peasant holdings. Estates that had supported a few dozen households in the late 11th century often supported twice or even 3 times that number by the mid-12th century. In some cases, this growth reflected real demographic expansion. In others, it resulted from the subdivision of existing holdings, the leasing out of land previously worked directly by lords, and the clearing of new land from woodland. Inheritance practices played an important role. In many regions, land was divided among sons rather than passed intact to a single heir. Over generations, this produced smaller and more numerous holdings. Lords also increasingly rented out portions of their own land to tenants for cash payments. Small plots were carved from estates and granted to individuals willing to cultivate them. At the same time, woodland was steadily cleared. These clearings were often small and irregular, defined by trees, paths, and marshy ground rather than by the open fields. They represented individual effort, usually rewarded with hereditary tenure in exchange for rent. Despite this expansion, the scale of clearance should not be exaggerated. Woodland diminished slowly rather than dramatically, and most farming still took place on long-established land. What changed more rapidly was the number of people dependent on that land. Population growth outpaced the increase in cultivated acreage, placing pressure on resources and gradually lowering living standards for many. Settlement patterns reflected both geography and economic activity. Some regions were dominated by compact villages with houses clustered tightly together. Elsewhere, especially in pastoral or wooded areas, people lived in scattered hamlets or isolated farmsteads. In many cases, villages themselves were relatively new creations. Archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that some settlements were deliberately planned during the late Anglo-Saxon and early Norman periods, laid out in orderly rows with regular plots. These villages were not timeless features of the landscape but products of social and economic change. Excavated villages allow us to glimpse everyday life. A typical peasant household occupied a timber building with a clay floor, a central hearth, and little separation between people and animals. Houses were small, often shared by a family of 5 or more, and offered warmth rather than comfort. Privacy was minimal. Windows were unglazed, roofs were thatched, and smoke filled the interior. These structures were fragile and temporary. After a generation or two, they decayed and were rebuilt or moved. What endured was the plot itself, a fenced or ditched croft that included garden space, animals, and sometimes small-scale cultivation. Agriculture was overwhelmingly based on arable farming. The plough was the foundation of rural life. Tens of thousands of plough teams worked the fields, turning heavy soil into ridges and furrows that still mark the landscape today. Oxen provided most of the power, slow but reliable, while horses were gradually introduced for speed and flexibility. Ploughing shaped both the appearance of the countryside and the organisation of landholding, producing long strips of cultivated earth that defined individual rights and obligations. Farmers grew a mixture of crops. Wheat and rye were sown in autumn, oats and barley in spring. Fields were divided between winter and spring grain to spread risk. Productivity was low by modern standards. Harvests were uncertain and heavily dependent on weather. Once seed was set aside and dues paid, little remained. In bad years, yields fell so low that seed had to be imported simply to plant the next crop. Attempts were made to improve the soil. Fields were rested, manured, and sometimes treated with chalk or lime. Drainage was improved where possible, yet these measures could only do so much. Medieval farming operated close to subsistence. A few weeks of rain, a late frost, or a summer drought could mean hunger. The limits of knowledge and technology left rural society exposed to forces beyond its control. In late 11th century England, we can only glimpse the full scale of rural wealth through scattered windows in the surviving records. Detailed lists of farm animals are not common, yet in a few areas where fuller information survives, a clear pattern emerges. On the great estates owned and managed by lords, sheep dominated the scene. They were the animal most likely to fill the countryside, grazing in large flocks on marshy ground and open highlands. Other animals mattered too, but in smaller numbers. Pigs appeared as a noticeable minority in some districts, while goats and non-working cattle were present but far less common. Horses were rare in these estate tallies, and were mainly used for hauling, light field work and transport rather than heavy ploughing. Even when we factor in the large number of working oxen required for plough teams, sheep still remain the most visible and widespread livestock. Oxen were essential for traction, yet when we look at all animals together, the overall balance still points toward a landscape where wool-bearing flocks were everywhere. This was not a short-lived snapshot. Evidence from the early 13th century suggests that England's livestock mix had not changed dramatically. In some rural regions, peasant households owned animals in proportions that still leaned strongly towards sheep. On major estates, flocks could make up an overwhelming majority of all recorded livestock, while cattle remained a clear second and pigs usually trailed behind. The picture becomes more complicated when we turn to archaeology. Bone fragments from villages, towns, and fortified sites do not always mirror written records. In many excavated rural settlements, sheep bones are common but not overwhelmingly so, and cattle sometimes appear almost as frequently. In towns and castles, cattle bones can be as common as, or even more common than, sheep. That difference does not necessarily mean the written record is wrong. What ends up in the ground depends on what people ate, how animals were processed, and what kinds of waste were dumped in particular places. A community that relied heavily on beef for meals will leave a stronger cattle signature in its refuse than a simple head count of animals might suggest. Across different regions and across the long medieval era, sheep and cattle clearly stand out as the two leading livestock groups, even if their exact balance varies by landscape, economy, and site type. As population pressure grew, the countryside faced a constant problem. Land was needed for crops, but animals still required grazing, and the soil could not produce endlessly without rest and nourishment. One major answer was the shared field system that shaped much of central England. Under this approach, large arable areas were cultivated in rotation. Each year, a substantial portion was left unplanted, serving as temporary grazing ground. Animals fed on stubble and weeds, and their droppings helped restore fertility. This arrangement kept crop production high, while still providing pasture and a natural method of fertilizing the land. Because manure was so valuable, control over where animals grazed became a serious matter of power. Lords often tried to channel livestock onto their own land at key times, turning dung into an economic advantage. In some places, peasants even had to perform specific work obligations simply to secure the right to manage their animals in the way that best supported household needs, such as bringing cows home for milking. Within this system, land was organised into 2 or 3 large cultivation blocks, and each holding was spread across them to balance risk and access. A household's arable strips were typically divided between different sides of the settlement, so no one relied on a single patch of ground. Records from the 12th century show holdings described as carefully distributed portions in each section of the cultivated land, sometimes with equal shares across all parts. 3-part rotations are also clearly visible by the mid-12th century in certain regions, where holdings were described as containing matching amounts in each cultivated block. This was not a purely individual world. Shared rotation required shared discipline. Everyone who held land in the common fields had to follow the same seasonal rhythm. No household could simply decide to plant whatever it wanted whenever it wanted. And when land was resting, animals could be turned loose across many individual strips, meaning that private cultivation and communal rights constantly overlapped. A holding was never only a field. It included a home plot, arable strips, meadow for hay, and grazing rights on wider land used in common. The lord's own farmland often lay scattered among peasant strips, forming a patchwork rather than a single compact block. This could help spread risk, but it also created tensions and inefficiencies. Sometimes lords reorganised the pattern, exchanging strips with tenants to concentrate their own land into a more unified block, especially when they wanted a quieter, more enclosed working space, or when they granted land to religious communities that wished to farm without constant interference. A well-rounded holding in such a village was an integrated survival system. The house plot provided space for a dwelling, garden and small animals. The arable strips produced grain, meadow yielded hay for winter, pasture supported sheep or cattle. Nearby wet ground or marshland could supply reeds, fuel, fish, birds and eggs. In watery environments, small log boats were used to move through reed beds and along shallow channels, making these resources accessible. For many communities, such extra landscapes were not optional. They were essential buffers in an economy where grain yields were low and bad seasons were always possible. But turning wilderness into fields was never a simple act of claiming empty space. Pasture, woodland and wetlands often already carried rights and traditions. Clearing could mean taking away grazing land from neighbours. Disputes flared when cultivation expanded into areas used in common. In some parts of England, people could even block clearance if it threatened grazing rights. Elsewhere, communities negotiated carefully, allowing enclosure while insisting that access to key common resources would remain protected. In a world with limited storage and low productivity, the harvest determined everything. Chroniclers repeatedly describe years when rain ruined crops, when fruit failed, when livestock sickness spread, and when human disease followed. Yet even in difficult times, mass starvation seems to have been less common than we might imagine. The greater danger often came when hunger weakened bodies and sickness swept through. Many accounts link scarcity and disease as a chain reaction. Poor weather damages the harvest, diets collapse, and illness becomes deadly. When writers wanted to show the severity of a crisis, they often focused on soaring grain prices, because price spikes were the clearest sign that ordinary people were being pushed toward desperation. Behind all of this stood the manor, the core machine of rural life. Most estates combined 2 major elements: peasant holdings rented out to households, and a home farm worked directly for the lord. Peasants paid rent in different forms, sometimes in money, sometimes through labour on the lord's land, and sometimes in goods. Meanwhile, the home farm was cultivated using a mix of estate workers, obligated labour from tenants and hired hands. A detailed example from the early 13th century shows how this system worked in practice. Cash income came heavily from peasant rents and fees, tied to everyday rights and obligations. There were also payments connected to local courts, which blended law, discipline and economics into one. Fines could involve violence or trespass, but they could also involve taking produce, entering a holding, or seeking permission for family matters like marriage. The lord was not only a landlord, he was also a judge and a master, and rural life was shaped by that mixture of authority. At the same time, the home farm was not simply a market business. Large areas were planted, and flocks were maintained, but much of what was produced never left the manor. A significant share of grain had to be kept for seed. Other portions fed estate staff and supported the heavy work days when tenants were required to labour and were given food and drink as part of the arrangement. Only a smaller fraction was sold. Animals followed a similar pattern. Some surplus might be traded, but much of the output was directed into household consumption at higher levels, especially in the form of wool, meat, and customary deliveries like poultry. Goods could flow upward to major centres where a lord's household operated, feeding kitchens and supporting wider administrative life. This brings us to the social structure underneath the system. England in this period was overwhelmingly a peasant world. Most people lived from small plots, using family labour, adding servants or extra hands when they could, or hiring themselves out when their land was too small. Work, home life, childcare, craft and exchange were not separate spheres. They blended into one continuous struggle to keep a household alive and stable. Peasant fortunes depended on two main forces: how much land a household controlled and what legal standing it had. Status mattered, but so did acreage. Some people would choose security of land over freedom, while others would choose freedom even if it meant becoming landless. That tension reveals how harsh dependency could feel and how fragile freedom could be without resources. The lowest rung in the rural hierarchy included people described as slaves in 11th century England. Slave raiding and trading existed, and some ports were notorious for exporting captives to other lands. Religious leaders condemned this commerce, and councils eventually banned the sale of human beings as if they were livestock. Later writers sometimes treated this as proof that England was becoming more civilized under new rulers. Yet the reality was more complex than the popular image of chained captives alone. Many of those labelled as slaves in estate records were not simply disposable property. They were often bound workers of the estate who had households, plots, and responsibilities, especially in heavy agricultural labour. They were unfree, but they were still part of the working community, and the boundary between unfree service and a more stable rural life could be blurred in practice. When we look closely at rural England in the late 11th and 12th centuries, one striking feature is how uneven social dependency was across the country. People described as slaves did not form a uniform group. In some western regions they made up a far larger share of the population than elsewhere, while in other parts of England they were relatively few. At the same time, the overall number of slaves was already falling. Comparisons between earlier and later records show a clear decline within a single generation, suggesting that slavery was not being renewed through raids or large-scale trade, but slowly fading away. This decline did not happen only because people were freed, although formal release did play an important role. Freeing dependents was widely regarded as a morally good act, and many landowners chose to do so. Over time, these acts of release were not replaced by new enslaved labour, yet the disappearance of slavery was also partly a matter of language. Estate workers who would once have been labelled slaves were now described using different terms. They continued to plough fields, tend animals, and serve their lords in much the same way, but under new names. Their living conditions and obligations often changed very little, even as the label attached to them did. Most people in medieval England lived from the land, and the size of a holding mattered enormously. Truly landless people were relatively rare. Even small plots could mean survival. Larger peasant holdings were capable of supporting a household and offered a degree of security, while smaller ones forced families to rely on extra labour or outside work. The classic full holding varied widely in size depending on region, but a more typical farm might consist of 30 or 40 acres. These full holders, however, were not the majority. On many estates they formed only a third of the peasantry. A large number held half-sized farms, still viable but more fragile. Below them stood small holders with just a few acres, and in some cases only a house and garden. Across England as a whole, peasant society was therefore sharply layered. Roughly half the rural population held land that could support a family with care. The other half lived on smaller plots, often close to the edge of subsistence. Legal freedom did not always match economic security. Some free peasants held little land, while others held more than many dependent tenants. Status and wealth did not always align. Over the course of the 12th century, the law began to draw firmer boundaries between free and unfree people. Earlier generations had lived with more flexible definitions. A villager was not automatically unfree. An older language often treated peasants as free householders. Gradually, however, royal justice began to reserve its protections for free tenants only. This sharpened the line between those who could appeal to royal courts and those who could not. As a result, being labelled unfree became far more serious than it had been before. This legal tightening created new social realities. A growing number of rural people were now clearly defined as dependent on their lords. Some could not leave their land without permission. Runaways were pursued and returned. Estate managers kept careful lists of people who had fled. Yet despite this pressure, individuals sometimes resisted. There are vivid stories of families attempting escape with their animals and possessions, risking pursuit in order to free themselves from crushing demands. Mobility, especially ownership of livestock, could make the difference between capture and success. Unfreedom was most starkly revealed when people themselves became transferable property. Individuals could be given away, sold, or inherited along with land. Documents from the late 12th century still record people being sold outright, along with their descendants yet unborn. This was not an abstract legal category. It meant chains, forced separation, and the constant threat of being treated as an asset rather than a person. As the law tried to define servitude more precisely, certain obligations came to be seen as markers of dependency. Payments made to marry off daughters, arbitrary financial demands, and uncertain labour duties became key signs. None of these, taken alone, always proved unfreedom, since similar payments could sometimes be required of free tenants. But together they formed a pattern. Above all, regular weekly labour on the lord's land, especially when its timing and nature were unpredictable, came to define the experience of dependent peasants. Earlier in the 12th century, these distinctions were still fluid. Some tenants moved from labour services to money rent. Others took on labour obligations in order to gain access to land. Over time, however, the law hardened these categories. What had once been a negotiable arrangement became a fixed status. By the early 13th century, a person labelled unfree was marked as such in a way that could no longer be escaped. Freedom itself was symbolised in powerful ways. The right to bear arms was one of the clearest signs of free status. In legal disputes, men defended their liberty by pointing to their weapons and their obligations under military law. Court cases reveal fierce arguments over status, with families divided, witnesses called, and juries asked to decide whether a man was free or bound. These cases show both how ambiguous rural status could be, and how intensely people valued personal liberty. Despite the harshness of rural dependency, large-scale peasant rebellion was almost entirely absent in this period. Lords frequently rebelled against kings, but peasants did not rise collectively against their lords. Resistance existed, but it was individual, quiet, and often desperate rather than organised. People fled, negotiated, delayed work, or asserted freedom in court, but they did not seek to overturn the social order itself. The daily reality of rural life was shaped above all by rent. Rent took many forms. Some tenants paid in silver, others worked several days each week on the lord's land, many did both. Detailed estate surveys allow us to see how these systems worked in practice. On some manors, larger tenants carried heavy labour obligations, especially ploughing, transport and seasonal work. Smaller tenants worked fewer days but still owed a wide range of duties. Craftsmen might hold land in exchange for practicing their trade for the lord. One person could even hold different plots under different terms at the same time. On other estates, particularly in regions closer to towns and markets, smallholders dominated. Here money rent mattered more than labour. Weekly work obligations were limited to a few specialised holdings, while most tenants simply paid cash. Rents were higher per acre, reflecting proximity to trade and the value of land in mixed farming zones of gardens, orchards and enclosed fields. In the far north, a different pattern appeared again. There, most tenants held similar-sized plots, and all were bound to heavy labour and payments in kind. Money rent existed, but it was combined with strict service requirements. The distinction between households was not based on freedom versus rent paying, but on how many days each group worked on the lord's farm. These examples show that there was no single model of rural life. Each manor represented a different balance between labour, cash, and produce. Geography, inheritance customs, institutional preferences, and access to markets all shaped the outcome. Everywhere, lords relied on the unpaid or underpaid labour of their tenants. Everywhere, peasants sought land, security, and dignity within the limits imposed on them. This complex web of obligations defined the countryside of medieval England. It was a world where land meant survival, where status could shape a lifetime, and where freedom, when it existed, was fiercely defended even when it could not be shared. During the Norman and Angevin period, England took part in the wider revival of urban life that was transforming much of Europe. This revival meant far more than simply larger settlements. It marked the rise of communities whose livelihoods depended not on farming, but on trade, craftsmanship, transport, law, entertainment, and a wide range of urban services. Towns became places where people lived by buying, selling, making, and serving, rather than cultivating the soil. At the same time, these new ways of living demanded new forms of organisation, new legal identities, and new collective rights. Urban life required its own rules. By the late 11th century, England already contained over 100 settlements that were recognised as towns. Some stood within the walls of long-abandoned Roman cities. Others had grown out of fortified Anglo-Saxon centres or developed around major religious institutions. A number were ports, tied to coastal and river trade. Despite their different origins, these places were increasingly grouped together as a distinct type of settlement, set apart from villages and manors by their functions, privileges and population density. Even the largest English towns of this period were small by modern standards, and smaller still when compared with the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet they were unmistakably urban. They were enclosed by walls or ditches, filled with workshops and markets, and marked by a concentration of people engaged in non-agricultural work. London stood apart as the largest city, followed by a handful of other important centres such as Winchester, York, Lincoln, Norwich, and Canterbury. Most of these towns occupied strategic positions at river crossings or inland ports, combining access to trade routes with administrative and religious importance. Urban growth continued steadily through the 12th and early 13th centuries. Existing towns expanded, while many entirely new towns were founded according to deliberate plans. These planned towns were laid out with regular plots, streets and market spaces, and populated by settlers attracted by privileges and opportunity. In some cases, land that had once been farmed was transformed into dense neighbourhoods of houses and workshops, serving both religious communities and surrounding rural populations. Winchester offers a clear example of what a major town looked like in this period. Within its ancient walls lay a crowded network of streets lined with houses, shops and parish churches. Beyond the walls, suburbs stretched along the roads leading into the city. Royal and ecclesiastical buildings occupied entire quarters, including palaces, monasteries, and a vast cathedral that ranked among the largest structures in Western Europe. A castle dominated one corner of the city, serving as a treasury and administrative centre. Winchester was not simply a place to live. It was a hub of power, religion, money, and craft. urban society was highly diverse. At the top stood wealthy merchants, moneyers, and officials who accumulated property and influence. Below them was a broad middle layer of skilled artisans, metal workers, textile producers, leather workers, builders, and food suppliers. Many townspeople had roots outside England, especially in northern France, and their names reveal the movement of people that followed conquest and trade. Most lived in modest conditions, crowded into narrow streets or makeshift housing in expanding suburbs. Yet despite poverty and congestion, town life offered opportunities that the countryside could not. What truly set towns apart, however, was law. Town dwellers lived under legal rules that differed sharply from those of the countryside. Urban residents paid fixed rents for their plots, defended their own settlements, and answered to their own courts. Property in towns could be bought and sold freely, and after a fixed period of peaceful possession it became legally secure. Burgesses were spared many of the burdens that weighed on rural tenants. They did not owe labour services, marriage payments, or death dues, and they were protected from arbitrary demands. One of the most powerful ideas associated with town life was freedom. A person who settled in a town and was accepted into its community could, over time, escape the personal dependence that bound rural tenants to their lords. This principle became famous in later centuries as the belief that town air itself could make a person free. Urban freedom was not absolute, but it was real, and it formed the foundation of town identity. Towns were also granted commercial advantages. Exemption from tolls allowed merchants to move goods more cheaply and profitably. These exemptions could apply locally or across wide regions depending on who granted them. Royal exemptions were especially valuable, giving town merchants an edge over competitors throughout the kingdom and beyond. Over time, individual towns developed distinctive legal customs, which were then copied by newer settlements. In this way, urban law spread outward from established centres to frontier towns and newly founded boroughs. Urban growth benefited lords as much as townspeople. Founding a town required payment, and once established, towns generated far greater income than farmland alone. Fixed rents, market dues, tolls, and legal profits made urban land enormously valuable. A striking example is a small rural manor that was transformed into a market town by the grant of urban privileges. Within a generation, the lord's income from rents multiplied many times over, demonstrating why both kings and nobles encouraged urban development. Despite this prosperity, English towns never achieved full independence. Royal authority remained strong, and urban self-government developed within clear limits. Town courts handled most civil disputes, but serious crimes remained under royal jurisdiction. Financial autonomy, however, proved decisive. When towns agreed to pay a fixed annual sum to their lord instead of variable dues, they effectively took responsibility for their own internal finances. This required collective organisation and encouraged the creation of town councils, officials, and seals. These institutions did not emerge from nothing. Townspeople were already accustomed to collective organisation through guilds. Early guilds began as mutual aid associations, providing support in times of illness, death, or disaster. Over time, they also became economic bodies, controlling entry into trades and excluding outsiders. Craft guilds defended monopolies, enforced standards, and collected fines. Merchant guilds in particular came to dominate town government, often becoming indistinguishable from the ruling body of the borough itself. A detailed view of urban self-government can be seen in the creation of a new town administration at the start of the 13th century. Over a series of public assemblies, townspeople elected officials, swore mutual oaths, created courts, appointed officers to enforce the law, established a common seal, and organised financial administration. Written records were produced to preserve the town's laws and privileges. In just a few months, a functioning urban government was created, complete with authority, revenue, and identity. Though presented as serving the common good, power rested firmly in the hands of a small urban elite. Above all English towns stood London. Its size, wealth, and confidence set it apart from every other settlement in the kingdom. It dominated trade, finance, and politics, and its citizens saw themselves as the leading community of England. The city's core lay within ancient walls, but its true reach extended far beyond them, incorporating surrounding settlements and controlling the main crossing of the Thames. Markets, workshops, churches, and docks filled the urban landscape. London's government was complex and powerful. Royal officials exercised authority, but local leaders controlled the wards and daily administration. The city elite consisted of families deeply embedded in both urban life and royal service. Over time, London negotiated greater control over its own affairs, especially during moments of political weakness. This culminated in the creation of a sworn urban commune and the emergence of a mayor as the city's chief officer. London's liberties were repeatedly confirmed, and its political weight ensured that its interests shaped wider constitutional developments. Despite inequality and tension, urban unrest was rare. When disorder did break out, it was usually swiftly suppressed. Even dramatic movements claiming to speak for the poor failed to overturn the social order. English towns were crowded, unequal, and often harsh places to live, but they did not generate sustained popular revolts during this period. Another distinctive feature of English towns was the presence of Jewish communities. There had been no Jewish population in England before the Norman conquest. Jewish settlers arrived from Normandy and established communities that would endure for over 2 centuries. By the late 12th century, Jewish populations could be found in most major towns, though their numbers remained small. They lived clustered together in particular streets, close to markets and centres of trade. Jewish communities possessed a degree of internal organisation and autonomy. They maintained synagogues and burial grounds, and handled many of their own legal affairs. Their cemeteries lay outside town walls, and burial practices followed their own traditions. Archaeological evidence reveals that these communities were close-knit, mobile, and distinct in physical characteristics due to their shared origins and marriage patterns. Economically, Jewish life in medieval England centred on money lending. Barred from many other occupations, Jews provided credit to all levels of society, from kings and bishops to lesser landowners. Loans were secured against movable goods, property, or land rights. Debts circulated, were bought and sold, and could reshape patterns of land ownership as borrowers defaulted and creditors transferred claims. Although Jews could hold urban property, rural land was treated differently. While Jewish lenders could take possession of estates pledged as security, they did not reside as rural lords. Instead, indebted land passed to other Christian owners once debts were cleared. In this way, Jewish lending played a major role in redistributing land, enabling those with ready cash to acquire estates from those overwhelmed by debt. Written loan documents survive in large numbers, showing a sophisticated financial culture. These records demonstrate that literacy was widespread within Jewish communities and that multiple languages were used for legal transactions. Interest rates were high, reflecting both risk and demand, and networks of debt bound together clergy, nobles, officials, and townspeople. By the end of the 12th century, Jewish finance had become deeply embedded in the English economy, closely supervised by the crown and increasingly exploited as a source of royal revenue. The scale of this activity was such that special administrative machinery was created to manage it. Jewish lenders shaped the flow of money, land, and power across medieval England, even as their own position remained vulnerable. In medieval England, Jewish communities occupied a unique and fragile position. They were not simply another group within society. By law and custom, they were considered to belong directly to the king. This special status had deep roots in European history. As a non-Christian minority, Jews did not fit easily into the local systems of protection that governed Christian society. They stood outside the usual bonds of lordship, parish, and communal defence. Because of this, they required a different form of security, which only the ruler could provide. Royal protection, however, was never offered freely. Kings protected Jewish communities because they regarded them as valuable assets. To harm Jews was not merely an act of violence against individuals, it was seen as an attack on royal property. When kings reacted angrily to assaults on Jews, their outrage was not driven by compassion, but by the sense that their authority and wealth had been damaged. Protection came at a price, and that price could be severe. Under Norman and Angevin rule, Jews were granted a defined set of legal rights. They were allowed to live on royal land, travel freely, and own property, including houses, goods, and financial claims. Disputes involving Jews were handled under strict rules. Cases had to be heard by royal officials, and both Christians and Jews were required to provide witnesses. Jewish inheritance rights were recognised, tolls were often waived, and certain safeguards existed to prevent arbitrary treatment. On paper, this framework offered significant security. In reality, this protection also made Jewish communities a source of easy revenue. Because they were considered the king's own, they could be subjected to extraordinary financial demands whenever the crown required money. These forced payments were often immense. Over short periods, Jewish communities were required to surrender sums that dwarfed the contributions demanded from other groups. Individuals were imprisoned, pressured, or ruined financially. Wealthy lenders were targeted first, but poorer Jews suffered as well, sometimes fleeing the country to escape ruin. Money lending lay at the heart of this relationship. Since Jews were restricted from many occupations, lending money became their primary economic role. Kings relied on this activity, both to fuel the economy and to extract profit from it. The crown closely supervised Jewish lending, intervening to enforce debts and claiming control over loans when a lender died. Over time, this supervision became increasingly elaborate. Loans were recorded, documents duplicated, and official chests created to store records. Access to these records required the presence of both Jews and Christians alongside royal officials, ensuring that the crown retained ultimate control. This system expanded across England. Specialised royal officers were appointed to oversee Jewish financial affairs. They dealt with disputes over debts, land pledged as security, and exemptions claimed by religious institutions. These officials kept detailed records, turning Jewish finance into one of the most thoroughly documented areas of the medieval economy. As a result, Jewish lending became deeply entangled with royal government, law, and landholding. This close connection also shaped public perception. Jewish moneylenders were often viewed not as independent actors, but as instruments of royal greed. Critics portrayed them as tools through which kings drained wealth from Christian society. Such ideas circulated widely, reinforcing resentment and hostility. Kings, meanwhile, sought to maintain exclusive control over Jewish communities, resisting interference from other authorities, including the church. This tension became clear when church leaders attempted to impose visible markers of difference on Jews, requiring them to wear distinctive clothing. While royal governments sometimes enforced these measures, they were also willing to suspend them in exchange for payment. This created a quiet but persistent conflict between royal and ecclesiastical priorities. Church councils demanded strict separation, while kings focused on revenue and control. In practice, discrimination could often be negotiated, at least temporarily, through money. Anti-Jewish hostility did not arise only from law or finance. It was deeply rooted in Christian culture. From late antiquity onward, Christian authorities had promoted a contradictory stance toward Judaism. Jewish religion was tolerated, but Jews were excluded from many areas of public life and subjected to legal and social restrictions. Conversion to Judaism was forbidden, while conversion from Judaism was encouraged but fraught with danger. In the 12th century, religious debate intensified. Christian writers produced works aimed at exposing what they saw as Jewish error and proving the truth of Christianity. These debates were often presented as dialogues between learned representatives of both faiths. While framed as intellectual exchanges, they reinforced the idea that Jews existed in error and ought eventually to convert. A small number did convert, sometimes sincerely, sometimes under pressure. Conversion, however, often meant total loss of property and separation from family and community. Converts frequently found themselves poor, isolated and mistrusted by Christians as well as rejected by Jews. Conversion in the opposite direction was treated as a grave crime. Rare cases of Christians adopting Judaism provoked extreme punishment, reinforcing the rigid boundaries between the two faiths. These boundaries became sharper over time, contributing to growing suspicion and fear. One of the most destructive developments of this period was the rise of violent anti-Jewish myths. England witnessed the first recorded accusation that Jews murdered Christian children for religious purposes. These stories had no basis in reality, but they spread rapidly and proved dangerously persuasive. They portrayed Jews as participants in secret conspiracies, repeating ritual killings year after year. Such accusations fed popular imagination and justified violence. These fantasies did not always lead to convictions, but they left lasting scars. Even when courts hesitated or dismissed cases, suspicion lingered. The combination of economic resentment, religious hostility, and political convenience created an atmosphere in which Jews were constantly at risk. The crusading movement intensified this danger. Across Europe, crusades sparked waves of violence against Jewish communities, as religious zeal turned inward against perceived enemies at home. England was largely spared in earlier crusades, but this changed dramatically at the end of the 12th century. With the launch of the Third Crusade, anti-Jewish violence erupted across the country. Attacks followed a grim pattern. Jewish houses were looted, communities assaulted, and entire neighbourhoods destroyed. In some towns, mobs were led by crusaders, artisans, or local elites burdened by debt. In others, violence was fueled by rumours, religious fervour, or the lure of plunder. Royal authority often failed to intervene in time, and local officials were sometimes complicit or overwhelmed. The most horrific episode occurred in the north, where an entire Jewish community sought refuge in a royal fortress. Surrounded by attackers and abandoned by those meant to protect them, they faced an impossible choice. Rather than submit to forced conversion or massacre, many chose death at their own hands. Those who attempted to surrender under promises of safety were betrayed and killed. Their debts were destroyed in a symbolic act that erased financial obligations along with human lives. The aftermath revealed the contradictions of royal policy. The Crown punished some perpetrators and reaffirmed protection for Jews, not out of mercy, but because royal interest had been damaged. Remarkably, Jewish communities returned even to places of extreme violence and rebuilt their lives under the same precarious protection as before. Despite repeated persecution, Jewish identity endured. Even under coercion, individuals asserted their faith and refused to abandon it in spirit. Their persistence highlights the resilience of a community that survived between privilege and vulnerability, protection and exploitation. Trade formed the wider economic backdrop to these events. People traded not out of curiosity but because profit was possible. Goods moved from where they were cheap to where they were valuable. Essential resources like salt and metal were traded constantly, as were animals, tools, leather goods, pottery and cloth. Although many households produced basic items themselves, professionally made goods were often cheaper, better and more reliable. Transport shaped trade patterns. Water routes were far cheaper than land routes, and England's rivers and coastline made it well suited to shipping. Many towns that seem inland today were once active ports. Coastal trade flourished alongside overseas exchange. Even so, transport costs were significant and factored heavily into prices. wealthy elites drove demand for luxury goods. Fine cloth, spices, wine, and exotic materials flowed into England because aristocrats could afford them. These purchases symbolised status as much as comfort. For ordinary workers, such items represented years of labour. This imbalance reveals how consumption reinforced social hierarchy. Not all goods moved through markets. Lords sometimes secured essential supplies directly through estates rather than purchase. Gift-giving also played a major role, especially among elites, where valuable objects circulated to create loyalty and display power. Nevertheless, markets and fairs expanded rapidly. Permanent markets multiplied, placing most rural populations within walking distance of trade centres. Larger annual fairs attracted international merchants and generated enormous income. These events operated under special legal rules, recognising the risks and opportunities of large gatherings of strangers and wealth. Roads, bridges and waterways formed the skeleton of this commercial world. Ancient highways were protected by royal authority, while countless smaller paths connected villages and towns. Travel was slow but reliable. Messages could cross the country in days, goods in weeks. Bridge building transformed landscapes, linking markets and encouraging growth. Monumental projects like stone bridges reshaped cities and became lasting symbols of economic life. By the early 13th century, overseas trade had grown dramatically. Wool exports tied England to continental manufacturing centres, while imports brought wine, cloth and luxury goods. Ports along the east coast dominated this exchange, though regional networks remained vital. Food was valued above all else when it had the power to prevent hunger. In years of poor harvests, grain became a matter of survival and had to be purchased rather than grown. Contemporary observers noted that London, flooded with foreign merchants, could secure food more cheaply than almost anywhere else, even during difficult years. This was because the city stood at the centre of import and export networks that rarely stopped moving. In a world where scarcity and uncertainty were constant threats, the trade in grain became a matter of policy as much as profit. England was usually spared from catastrophic famine. Grain was sometimes imported, but far more often it was exported. This export trade was closely controlled by royal authority. No one could legally send grain abroad without the king's permission, and that permission had to be paid for. Merchants who ignored this rule were fined heavily, and those who traded with regions declared hostile to the crown faced even harsher punishment. Despite the risks, the export of grain from eastern England to Scandinavia and the Low Countries was significant enough to tempt merchants to defy restrictions. Fish formed another essential pillar of the medieval diet. Herring was abundant along England's east coast and could be caught in enormous quantities. Once salted and transported, it provided a cheap and reliable source of protein. For rural labourers and the urban poor, herring filled the same role that later centuries would assign to the potato. Religious communities depended especially on fish, since their rules forbade meat on many days of the year. Large-scale journeys were undertaken simply to secure steady supplies of salted fish for monastic tables. Salt itself was indispensable. Without refrigeration, it was the primary means of preserving food. Coastal salt production therefore held enormous importance, and England's shores were dotted with salt works. Inland centres also existed, serving regions far from the sea. Salt was not a luxury, but a foundation of everyday survival. Wine, by contrast, was a luxury shaped by culture and power. Although vineyards existed in England, they could not meet demand in either quantity or quality. Wine flowed in from the continent, especially from France, where English kings also ruled vast territories for much of this period. Political connections shaped trade routes, and shifts in royal power redirected the flow of wine imports over time. By the early 13th century, wine from southwestern France had become dominant, establishing patterns that would last for centuries. Metal was another essential commodity. Tools, weapons, and construction depended on reliable supplies of iron, lead, and tin. England possessed workable deposits, though not evenly distributed. Certain regions became known for their production, supplying not only local needs but royal armies and large building projects. Iron tools were produced in vast quantities, while lead travelled long distances to roof churches and monasteries across Europe. Mining booms could transform regions, only to collapse when yields declined or costs rose. Tin stood apart as one of England's most important exports. Mined almost entirely in the southwest, it was heavy, valuable, and increasingly demanded. Production rose dramatically over a few decades, and tin became a crucial return cargo for wine merchants. It supported a specialised regional economy that endured far beyond the Middle Ages. Sheep dominated the English countryside. They provided food, dairy products, and above all wool. The rapid expansion of textile manufacturing across the Channel created an insatiable demand for English wool. Merchants arrived with large quantities of silver to purchase it, transporting bullion into England and raw materials back to the looms of northern Europe. England became a supplier of food and resources for one of the most industrialised regions of the medieval world. Not all wool left the country. Textile production also flourished within England. Fine embroidery, dyed cloth, and various grades of woolen fabric were produced for domestic use and export. Different types of cloth served different markets, from coarse fabrics used to clothe armies to expensive dyed textiles sold abroad. Some English cloth became internationally sought after. Textile production was complex and highly organised. Spinning was done almost entirely by women, often in domestic settings. Once spun, the yarn passed into male hands, where weaving required looms and workshops. After weaving came fulling, a heavy and physically demanding process that cleaned and thickened the cloth. This stage was among the first to be mechanised, as water-powered mills replaced human labour. Dyeing followed, requiring imported materials and significant capital. Those who controlled dyes often dominated the entire industry. This system displayed features recognisable from later industrial economies. Production was divided into stages, carried out by specialised workers in different locations. Mechanisation increased output. Conflicts arose between capital-owning entrepreneurs and manual labourers. Although England remained largely rural, it had developed a manufacturing sector of real scale, one that would shape its economy for centuries. Money underpinned all of this activity. English coinage was renowned for its high silver content and stability. The silver penny became the backbone of daily exchange, while larger sums existed only as accounting units. Royal authority tightly controlled minting, reinforcing both economic order and political power. Coins bore the king's image, projecting authority into every market and household. The crown enforced strict standards. Counterfeiting or debased coinage was punished with extreme severity. Recoinages periodically withdrew old money and replaced it with new designs, generating profit for the king and reinforcing control. Over time, these reforms created one of the most trusted currencies in Europe. Silver flowed into England through trade, increasing the amount of money in circulation. By the early 13th century, tens of millions of pennies were in use. Transporting such quantities posed serious challenges. Officials, merchants, and tenants alike faced the practical problem of moving heavy sums of silver across long distances, often twice a year. Bags, chests, guards, and escorts became essential elements of economic life. Prices rose sharply around the year 1200. Grain, livestock, and other essentials became far more expensive. This inflation reflected both increased demand and a growing supply of silver. More money chased limited resources, while international trade and warfare accelerated monetization. Rents shifted from labour and produce toward cash. Credit expanded. Debt became widespread. Land itself was increasingly measured in monetary terms. Properties were described not only by size but by the income they generated. This reflected a new way of thinking, in which land was valued as a financial asset rather than simply a source of subsistence. Not everyone welcomed this transformation. Many viewed commerce with suspicion, seeing profit as something gained at another's expense. Aristocratic culture often expressed disdain for trade, even while benefiting from it. Yet resistance could not halt change. England was becoming a monetized and commercial society, bound together by silver, markets, and long-distance exchange. This transformation reshaped everyday life. People traded more, travelled further, borrowed and lent money, and depended increasingly on markets rather than self-sufficiency. By the early 13th century, commercialization was no longer an innovation. It was a fact of life, woven into the fabric of medieval England. From its establishment in the early Middle Ages until its deep transformation in the early modern era, the English Church stood at the centre of social life. It was not a distant institution, but a constant presence. Birth, marriage, and death were almost universally marked by Christian rituals. Baptism welcomed individuals into the community, marriage shaped family life, and burial defined the final moment of belonging. These moments were overseen by trained religious specialists whose clothing, appearance, and legal status set them apart from everyone else. The church shaped morality, belief, and education. Literacy and formal learning were largely controlled by clerics and religious communities. Monks, canons, and priests preserved writing, taught students, and advised rulers. Economically, the church was enormously powerful. By the late 11th century, it controlled a vast share of the land and claimed a fixed portion of agricultural income across the country. This combination of wealth, reach, and influence made the church one of the most formative forces in medieval England. At the heart of the church stood a complex hierarchy. One basic division shaped medieval thinking: cleric and layperson. A man marked by the clerical haircut entered a separate social order. From that moment he enjoyed certain privileges and accepted specific obligations. Clerics were a minority, but they were everywhere. They served as parish priests, cathedral officials, teachers, scribes, chaplains, and administrators. They were expected to dress plainly, avoid violence, and live by different standards from ordinary society. Within the clergy itself there were layers. Some men were tonsured but never ordained. Others received minor orders and could still marry. Higher offices required higher ordination, but in practice status and function did not always match. Men could hold influential church positions without being fully ordained, while others rose suddenly and completed their ordination only after appointment. This produced a system that was flexible, sometimes chaotic, and often shaped by opportunity rather than strict rule. The most visible face of the church for most people was the parish priest. Baptisms and burials normally took place at the parish church, which stood at the centre of a local life. These churches possessed features that defined their authority: the baptismal font and the graveyard. These were not merely buildings and land, they marked entry into and exit from the community, and control over them gave the parish priest great importance. Parish churches lived on several sources of income. Offerings were expected at major life events, even if officially described as voluntary. Regular collections and customary payments formed another stream of revenue. In addition, many churches owned land that could support a priest comfortably. Some parishes controlled holdings large enough to rival substantial farms, making church office financially attractive. The most controversial income was the tithe. A tenth of agricultural produce was claimed as a religious obligation. For small farmers living close to survival, this demand often felt harsh. Resistance and evasion were common, while clergy worked relentlessly to enforce payment. Conflicts over tithe could be dramatic, sometimes symbolic, as when disputed harvests were destroyed rather than allowed to pass into secular hands. These moments revealed the uncompromising nature of ecclesiastical authority. Because churches generated income, they became valuable assets. Monasteries and powerful individuals sought to control them. In many cases, the priest who received the income did not live in the parish and might never even visit it. Services were left to a poorly paid substitute. Over time, religious institutions increasingly preferred direct control, keeping church revenues for themselves and paying priests fixed stipends. This mirrored wider trends in estate management and administration. Alongside parish churches stood chapels. Some served distant communities within large parishes. Others belonged to monasteries or wealthy lords. In remote areas, chapels arose from necessity. Long journeys to the parish church, especially in winter, were dangerous and exhausting. New foundations reduced hardship and reshaped religious geography. Over generations, some chapels gained baptismal and burial rites, although they often remained subordinate to older churches. Burial rites were fiercely defended. Funerals brought income, and parish churches resisted any attempt to divert bodies elsewhere. Conflicts over burial could be bitter. In some cases, bodies were exhumed and reburied in the proper churchyard. For families living miles away, this could mean long and painful journeys with the dead, particularly in bad weather. The growth of parish networks took centuries. Average parish size varied greatly, but in most regions people lived within a short walk of their church. In remote northern and western areas, parishes could cover vast territories. During the late 11th and 12th centuries, this network was still evolving. New churches appeared gradually, often first as chapels, later as full parishes. Written records capture this slow expansion, but the process itself was driven by population growth, lordly initiative, and local need. One of the most intense conflicts within the church concerned clerical marriage. For generations, priests had lived openly with wives and raised children. Church offices often passed from father to son. Reformers sought to end this tradition. They argued that priests should be celibate and that churches should not become hereditary property. This campaign met deep resistance, rooted in custom and family responsibility. Despite repeated bans, married clergy did not disappear overnight. Some priests continued to live with women and raise families. Others sought to secure church offices for their sons as a form of inheritance. Reformers persisted, backed by church councils and papal authority. Over time, the higher clergy largely conformed to the new ideals, but at parish level the reality remained messy and human. Secular law reinforced reform. Children of priests were increasingly treated as illegitimate in legal disputes, losing inheritance rights. This undercut clerical dynasties and weakened the transmission of church offices through family lines. Even so, priestly households remained common well into the 13th century, drawing criticism from moralists and reformers alike. While these struggles unfolded, the physical church was being rebuilt on an unprecedented scale. Stone replaced wood. Churches were enlarged, embellished, and transformed. Parish churches grew more imposing. Fonts, doorways, towers, and carved decoration turned local buildings into visible symbols of authority and faith. These structures dominated villages and shaped everyday experience. Cathedrals rose even more dramatically. Vast new buildings replaced older ones, transforming episcopal cities. Their scale, complexity, and ambition reflected the power of bishops and the resources at their disposal. New architectural techniques spread, creating interiors of stone vaults, soaring columns, and light-filled spaces that inspired awe. Cathedrals were also centres of administration. Bishops oversaw appointments, judged disputes, managed lands, and advised kings. Their authority extended far beyond worship. Large dioceses required delegation, leading to the rise of archdeacons and other officials. This created a dense administrative network that reached into every parish. Archdeacons enforced discipline, inspected churches, and exercised judicial power. Their authority made them unpopular. Accusations of greed and oppression were common. Some clerics refused such offices, fearing moral corruption, yet archdeacons embodied the growing reach of ecclesiastical government. At the core of cathedral life stood the cathedral chapter. These bodies of canons controlled wealth, education, and influence. Over time, cathedral property was divided into individual incomes, creating a clerical elite deeply embedded in politics and royal administration. Many canons were frequently absent, employing deputies to perform religious duties while they served elsewhere. Cathedral chapters became networks of power. Family ties, patronage, and education shaped appointments. These men wrote histories, served kings, administered dioceses, and accumulated property. Their world combined spiritual authority with political ambition. Above all, bishops stood the two archbishops. Their rivalry shaped English church politics for generations. Disputes over precedence, authority, and status consumed councils and poisoned relations. Arguments over seating arrangements symbolised deeper conflicts over supremacy. These tensions never fully disappeared, even when papal rulings failed to resolve them. Appointments to bishoprics were rare and highly political. A bishop became a spiritual leader, landlord, judge, and royal advisor. Many ruled their sees for decades. Official ideals described bishops as wise, humble, learned, and pure. In practice, political skill, loyalty, and administrative ability mattered just as much. When William took control of England in the late 11th century, he entered a political world in which royal power and church authority were already deeply intertwined. This was not a new arrangement. For centuries, kings and bishops had worked together, shaping government, law, and belief as a single system. The Church did not merely bless royal rule from a distance. It supplied the skills that early medieval kings needed: literacy, administration, ideology, and moral authority. In return, rulers granted lands, wealth, and influence to senior churchmen. This partnership had ancient roots. Ever since the Roman emperors embraced Christianity, rulers across Western Europe had relied on bishops as advisors and administrators. As new kingdoms emerged from the ruins of Rome, Christian leaders provided continuity, structure, and knowledge. Over time, clerics became indispensable to government. They drafted documents, kept records, managed finances, and organised recruitment for war. By the time of the Norman conquest, England's church was already organised in a way that resembled a modern state more closely than the monarchy itself. It had a clear hierarchies, defined territories, formal offices, elections, procedures, and a strong attachment to written record. This is why so many of the great institutions of Norman and Angevin government were shaped by churchmen. Systems of taxation, justice, and record-keeping all bore the imprint of bishops and senior clerks. The boundary between sacred and secular administration was thin. Those trained within the church were perfectly suited to run a kingdom. Most bishops during this period came from three broad backgrounds. The largest group consisted of royal clerks, men who had served directly in the king's administration. For them, a bishopric was the highest reward. Chancellors often received such offices almost automatically, but lesser officials could also rise this way. A second group came from within the church itself. These men had built careers as cathedral officials, archdeacons, household clerks of bishops, or respected scholars. They were not royal servants, though family connections and patronage often played a role in their advancement. The third group consisted of monks and members of religious communities, who supplied a significant minority of bishops, especially in the earlier decades. These categories were not rigid. A talented clerk might move from royal service to church administration, or the other way around. Some men held several ecclesiastical offices before becoming bishops. Yet over time, patterns emerged. In the early Norman period, royal clerks dominated the episcopate. Later, monks declined in importance, while career churchmen without royal backgrounds became more common. The first Norman kings used bishoprics openly as political tools. William and his immediate successors appointed trusted chaplains and officials to key sees. These bishops often ruled their dioceses for decades, giving stability to royal policy. By filling the episcopal bench with loyal servants, kings ensured that the church carried a distinctly pro-monarchical tone. Monks formed the second major group in the early period. England had an unusual number of dioceses served by monastic communities rather than cathedral clergy. This arrangement dated back to earlier reforms and was accepted, even expanded by the Normans. In several dioceses, monks regularly became bishops, especially where monastic traditions were strong. Yet even here tensions existed. Some secular clerics resented being ruled by monks, seeing it as a loss of prestige. Despite the number of monastic cathedrals, England did not develop an overwhelmingly monastic episcopate. Compared to other regions, monks remained a minority. Over time, their influence declined further, especially as kings and church leaders preferred candidates with administrative experience. A new type of bishop emerged in the early 12th century. These were ecclesiastical professionals who had advanced through the internal hierarchy of the church rather than through royal service. Some were relatives of powerful churchmen, others were archdeacons or noted scholars. Their rise reflected the growing complexity of the church as an institution with its own career paths. By the reign of Henry II, such figures formed a large share of episcopal appointments. Another striking feature of the English episcopate after the conquest was its foreign character. Within a generation, almost all native English bishops had been replaced by men of continental origin or descent. Many had served in Norman or French religious institutions before coming to England. This foreign dominance lasted for decades. Only gradually did men born in England begin to appear among the bishops, and even then many were culturally French. For ordinary English clergy, this could be alienating. Some complained that they could not even speak to their superiors without knowing French. The reign of Stephen marked a break in established patterns. During this period of civil war and uncertainty, control over episcopal appointments slipped away from the crown and into the hands of powerful church figures. Royal clerks virtually disappeared from new appointments. Monks and church professionals dominated instead. By the end of Stephen's reign, only one bishop still represented the old royal administrative model. Henry II quickly restored royal influence. He returned to the practice of promoting loyal servants, appointing experienced officials and administrators to vacant sees. Yet the situation was no longer exactly as it had been under the early Normans. The church now possessed a more developed internal hierarchy. Career churchmen and educated specialists could not simply be ignored. Under Henry, these ecclesiastical professionals often outnumbered royal clerks. Later kings pushed royal influence even further. Officials from the royal household, men skilled in finance and administration, again became bishops in large numbers. By this time, however, many had passed through advanced systems of education. Learning, bureaucratic skill and visible piety all became recognized routes to advancement. The episcopate remained one of the few institutions that allowed significant social mobility. Despite this cooperation, tensions between royal and priestly authority never disappeared. Over the course of more than a century, 3 major conflicts erupted between kings and archbishops of Canterbury. These confrontations led to exile, spiritual sanctions, and, in one case, murder. Each conflict revolved around similar issues: control of appointments, the nature of church property, and the limits of royal authority. In the first conflict, disputes accumulated over taxation, loyalty, and the independence of church leadership. Frustration drove the archbishop into exile, during which the king absorbed the revenues of the vacant office. When a compromise was finally reached, it confirmed a lasting settlement. Kings would no longer bestow spiritual symbols of office, but bishops would continue to perform acts of loyalty to the crown. The second conflict followed a similar path but ended far more violently. A former royal servant turned archbishop found himself locked in a struggle over law, property, and the treatment of clerics in royal courts. After years of exile and negotiation, reconciliation proved fragile. The archbishop returned home only to be murdered in his own cathedral by men convinced they were serving royal wishes. The third conflict went further still. This time, the king faced not only an archbishop but the full authority of the papacy. When royal resistance hardened, the church imposed spiritual sanctions on the entire kingdom. Church services were suspended, bishops fled, and the king seized vast ecclesiastical revenues. Eventually, internal opposition and foreign threats forced submission. England was placed under papal authority, and normal church life resumed only after years of disruption. Throughout these crises, kings demonstrated remarkable resilience. They tolerated long absences of archbishops, filled other vacant bishoprics with loyal servants, and profited enormously from confiscated revenues. Disputes with the church were costly, but also lucrative. Control over appointments remained in practice firmly in royal hands. Underlying these struggles were deeper disagreements. One concerned property. Churches were spiritual centres, but they were also land-holding institutions. Kings and lords believed that church lands had originated as lay gifts, and therefore remained subject to secular authority. Bishops insisted that spiritual office could not be reduced to feudal property. In practice, bishops lived double lives. They were pastors of souls and powerful landholders at the same time. Another dispute concerned law. Clerics claimed protection under a separate legal system. Kings accepted this only partially. Over time, the church secured the right to try its members in ecclesiastical courts. At the same time, both royal and church justice expanded rapidly, making it essential to define their boundaries. By the early 13th century, most of these boundaries had been settled through compromise. The involvement of clergy in royal justice gradually declined. While bishops had once served regularly as judges, concerns about spiritual pollution and divided loyalties grew stronger. Over time, lay officials took over most judicial roles, leaving churchmen to their own courts. Relations with the papacy also intensified. Appeals to Rome multiplied. English churchmen travelled frequently to seek rulings. Papal representatives exercised authority within England. Over time, the Pope became deeply involved in English ecclesiastical life, influencing appointments, law, and finance. Kings adjusted to this reality. While they lost some control, they retained significant informal power, especially when relations with the papacy were cooperative. Alongside these institutional developments, religious life itself expanded dramatically. Monasteries were founded at an unprecedented rate. Monastic ideals emphasized stability, poverty, obedience, sexual restraint, and the suppression of personal will. To become a monk was, in law and in spirit, to die to the world. Monks were recruited both as children and as adults. In earlier generations, children were often given to monasteries by their families. Over time, this practice declined as ideas of personal choice gained strength. Adult conversion became more prominent. Such conversions could be dramatic, especially when nobles abandoned wealth and status for the cloister. Entering a monastery had serious consequences. Families lost heirs. Lands fell into royal custody. Wives and children could become wards of the crown. Religious commitment often meant personal sacrifice, not only for the individual, but for those left behind. Despite strict ideals, monastic life was not free from tension. Silence, discipline, and communal living tested human patience. Reformers frequently complained about gossip, laziness, and resistance to discipline. Yet monasticism retained enormous prestige. Even those who mocked it in life often sought its protection at death, taking monastic vows on their deathbeds to secure spiritual safety. At the moment of the Norman conquest, England already possessed a small but established monastic landscape. Most monasteries belonged to the Benedictine tradition and dated back to the great religious revival of the 10th century. These houses were unevenly distributed. Large regions of the country had none at all, while others contained long-established centres of wealth and devotion. Their resources varied enormously. Some were among the richest institutions in the land, while others struggled to survive. Communities of nuns were far fewer and generally much poorer, forming only a small minority of religious houses. After the conquest, this limited monastic world changed rapidly. New religious movements began to arrive from the continent, particularly from France, bringing new styles of communal life, discipline, and organisation. Some orders were variations on older traditions, while others introduced entirely new structures. In some cases, the change lay in stricter rules and customs, in others in the way monasteries were governed and linked together. Only one new religious order was native to England, a rare exception in a period otherwise dominated by imported ideas. To the medieval eye, the most obvious distinction between these different communities was visual. Clothing mattered, colour mattered. Black habits, white habits, cloaks and cowls all signalled identity. A second, less obvious difference lay between monks and canons, although even contemporaries were sometimes unsure how to define the boundary. To many observers, the growing complexity of religious life could be reduced to a simple contrast. Black and white, monk and canon, male and female. The spread of monasticism can be clearly seen at local level. In regions such as Devon, early medieval England had possessed only a handful of ancient Benedictine houses. These were modest foundations by national standards and controlled relatively limited estates. In the years after the conquest, they were joined by a wave of smaller dependent priories, many of them linked to great monasteries in Normandy or northern France. These new houses were founded quickly and in clusters, reflecting the cultural loyalties of Norman landholders and their continued ties across the Channel. Most of these early foundations were modest in scale. Few housed large communities. Many existed primarily as local spiritual centres and administrative outposts of foreign abbeys. Female communities were even rarer. In some regions, only a single nunnery existed, standing alone amid a landscape otherwise dominated by male religious houses. From the early 12th century onward, new kinds of religious life appeared. The Augustinian canons brought a form of communal living that was more outward-facing and flexible. They often replaced older religious institutions rather than building entirely new ones. Former collegiate churches were reorganized, and secular clergy were gradually transformed into regular canons. These houses tended to be smaller, less wealthy, and more closely connected to local society. Their growth was steady and widespread, particularly among patrons of middling rank, rather than kings or great magnates. The final major wave of foundations belonged to the reform movements that sought a purer and more demanding form of monastic life. Among these, the white-clad monks gained particular prominence. Their communities emphasized simplicity, austerity, and strict obedience. They avoided elaborate decoration and rejected the rich ceremonial traditions of older monasteries. Their churches were plain, their lives disciplined, and their reputation formidable. These reformed houses were not isolated experiments. They formed tightly organised networks that stretched across Europe. Each monastery belonged to a chain of responsibility linking it to a mother house and ultimately to a single spiritual centre abroad. Annual gatherings reinforced unity and discipline. This structure gave the order an internal cohesion, unlike anything previously seen in the monastic world. Their ideals attracted large numbers of recruits. Men from noble households, royal service, and even other religious communities abandoned comfortable lives to join what they saw as a more authentic path. Conversion stories circulated widely, describing the emotional power of first encounters with these monks and the overwhelming attraction of their way of life. Yet the discipline was severe. Food was plain, Labour was hard and the rhythm of prayer relentless. Some new members struggled deeply with regret before either leaving or learning to endure. To sustain their strict ideals, these communities reshaped economic practice. They avoided reliance on peasant rents and instead worked their lands directly. This led to the creation of a new class within the monastery, the lay brothers. These men took vows and lived under monastic discipline, but were excluded from full participation in the spiritual life. They laboured in fields, workshops and barns while the choir monks devoted themselves to prayer. Though essential to monastic success, their subordinate status created deep social divisions. Tensions sometimes erupted violently. In at least one religious order, resentment among lay brothers grew into open rebellion. Complaints range from harsh discipline to accusations of moral corruption among their superiors. At heart, these conflicts reflected a clash between educated clerics and illiterate labourers forced into a life of obedience without authority or dignity. The monastery, intended as a place of harmony, could become a stage for class conflict. Not all religious orders sought expansion or large numbers. One small and demanding community aimed to combine solitude with communal discipline. Its members lived mostly alone, meeting only for worship. Their houses were tiny, their rules severe, and their reputation formidable. They rejected worldly involvement almost entirely. Admirers praised their purity, while critics accused them of spiritual selfishness and pointless isolation. Their arrival in England was limited to a single foundation, but its influence far exceeded its size. Religious life for women followed a different path. Opportunities were far fewer, and female communities were always greatly outnumbered by male ones. Women could not perform priestly functions and were excluded from certain kinds of labour, making complete self-sufficiency impossible. Most nuns entered religious life through family decision rather than personal vocation. For many families, placing a daughter in a nunnery was a respectable and sometimes cheaper alternative to marriage. Some nunneries were wealthy and aristocratic, supported by royal and episcopal patronage, and filled with high-born women. Others were small, local institutions serving the gentry. Nunneries could function as safe havens for widows, unmarried women, or those unable to secure a place in secular society. Yet their security depended heavily on reputation. Chastity was central to their survival, and any threat to it could provoke extreme reactions. Stories survive of severe punishments imposed within female communities when sexual scandal arose. These episodes, though rare, reveal how fragile monastic prestige could be. For women living enclosed lives under public scrutiny, moral failure threatened not just individuals but the existence of the community itself. Violence and cruelty in such cases expressed both fear and desperation. By the early 13th century, England possessed hundreds of religious houses of many different types. The pace of foundation slowed, but the institutional landscape had been transformed. Monasteries and nunneries shaped land use, education, spirituality, and local economies. They offered refuge, discipline, ambition, and conflict. Far from being isolated from society, they were deeply embedded within it. This monastic world was not uniform or peaceful. It was layered with hierarchy, divided by class and gender, shaped by ideals but constrained by human weakness. Yet it formed one of the most powerful and enduring structures of medieval England, influencing belief and behaviour for centuries. Not everyone who longed for a life devoted entirely to God entered a monastery. Alongside monks, canons and nuns, medieval England still offered another path, stepping away from community life and choosing prayer in near-complete solitude. These solitary devotees were never the majority, yet they appeared across the country in surprising numbers. Some were permanently enclosed in small rooms attached to churches, sealing themselves away for the rest of their lives. Others lived as wandering hermits, free to move from place to place, but committed to a quiet rhythm of prayer, fasting, and charitable work. we can glimpse this world through a handful of well-known lives. A priest in Somerset chose confinement beside his church and remained there for decades. A highborn young woman resisted an arranged marriage, escaped her family's plans, and spent years living in tiny rooms under the guidance of other holy recluses before becoming the guardian of a hermitage herself. Another figure, born to humble parents, spent years travelling and trading before abandoning that restless career and settling into a hermit's existence near the North's great religious centres. These stories survive because they were dramatic, but they were not unique. Solitaries of one kind or another were scattered through towns, villages, and the edges of woodland. Royal records even suggest that the crown regularly supported small numbers of enclosed recluses year after year, offering modest daily payments to help keep them alive. Some lived beside city churches and became familiar local presences. A few can even be traced over many years in surviving accounts, suggesting that this solitary religious life was stable enough to be treated as a recognised part of the spiritual landscape. Because enclosure was so serious, it required a ceremony that felt almost like a funeral. The candidate entered the church and lay stretched out on the floor while prayers were chanted over them. Holy water and incense mark the moment as sacred. Candles were placed in their hands, readings were spoken about withdrawing from the world, and the final act followed. After worship, the new recluse was led into the small chamber that would become their entire universe. The doorway was then sealed as the clergy withdrew, singing words associated with death and burial as if the person had already passed from ordinary life. Yet even with this grave tone, enclosure did not mean total silence from the outside world. These cells were built with openings designed for specific forms of contact. One opening allowed the recluse to witness services inside the church. Another connected to servants who brought food and managed practical needs. A third allowed conversation with visitors. This meant that many recluses, despite their isolation, remained closely connected to the communities around them. People came seeking counsel, prayers, blessings, and sometimes healing. The cell could become a spiritual crossroads, a place where fear, hope, gossip, and devotion met. And that last word matters: gossip. Religious advisors repeatedly warned that too much conversation could poison the solitary life. If the window became a stage for rumours and endless talk, then the cell was no longer a refuge from the world, but simply another corner of it. Some writers painted sharp portraits of idle chatter gathering at the window, turning devotion into a steady stream of scandal and noise. Solitaries could also be difficult neighbours. They depended on local networks for food, and disputes over supplies could quickly become tense. Stories circulated of holy recluses who reacted strongly when denied support, and tales of sudden misfortune falling upon those who refused them help. Whether we treat these as moral warnings, legends, or remembered events, the message is clear. These isolated holy figures were not invisible. They had influence, and sometimes that influence unsettled the people living closest to them. Then, near the end of the period we are following, a new movement arrived that reshaped everything again. In the early 13th century, England was introduced to a striking new kind of religious life: the friars. Unlike monks who remained enclosed behind monastery walls, these men were expected to move. They travelled, preached, and worked in the growing towns. They aimed to live from charity rather than large landed estates, and they focused on teaching, mission, and public preaching. They headed straight for places where ideas moved fastest, especially the universities, and quickly became powerful voices in the intellectual world. Their arrival was not cautious or slow. Within a short span, new houses appeared in key English centres, and their influence spread rapidly. Before the middle of the century, friars were established across many major towns, becoming one of the most visible religious forces in urban life. They changed how people heard sermons, how students learned theology, and how the church presented itself to ordinary men and women. Their story became one of the defining developments of medieval religion, opening a chapter that belongs to the next stage of England's spiritual history. Medieval Christianity, like many religions, treated certain people, places, objects and moments as set apart from ordinary life. These things were not meant to be handled like everyday reality. They were approached with special respect, and the Church used many public rituals to mark them as sacred. A bishop's service book from this era could include instructions not only for appointing clergy and dedicating churches, but also for blessing items that touch daily life: bells, candles, church ornaments, palm branches for major festivals, salt for baptism, a pilgrim's staff, a knight's sword, and even the fire and water used in ordeals. When these were blessed through the proper ceremony, they were no longer treated as simple objects. They became officially holy. A church dedication shows how this worked in practice. When a bishop dedicated a church, he began by walking around the building in a formal procession multiple times, as if drawing a boundary between common ground and holy ground. Once inside, he marked the floor with a large cross-shaped pattern using letters, then prepared a special mixture using salt, water, wine, ash, and holy oil. With this, he sprinkled both the inside and outside of the church repeatedly, because people believed unseen forces could cling to places and needed to be driven out. After that, he marked crosses on the walls with holy oil at set points, placed relics into the altar, blessed the altar cloth, changed into clean vestments, and celebrated Mass, ending with preaching that explained the meaning of what had just been done. People also believed that even the ingredients used in holy rituals had to be made safe first. Natural substances like water or salt were not assumed to be spiritually neutral. They might carry harmful influence until they were purified. That is why blessings often included forceful words that treated evil as something real and active. Only after those words were spoken could the water be used to protect people, cleanse spaces, and define sacred borders. Sacred power was carried not only by speech, but also by substances and gestures. Holy water, made each week through blessing, became one of the most widely used tools of sanctification. It was used in funerals, major seasonal ceremonies, and the welcome of important visitors. It was also used in emergencies. Stories circulated of demons being driven away by holy water, of monks using it to defend a monastery after a terrifying strike of lightning, and of clergy guarding baptismal water so it could not be stolen for magical use. For medieval believers, blessed water was not symbolic decoration. It was protective force. Oil was just as important. Different kinds of sacred oil were used for different purposes, one for baptism, one for the sick, and a more precious mixture for major rites like confirmation and ordination. These oils were blessed by a bishop at a key moment in the church year, and once prepared they could be stored and distributed where needed. People sometimes believed that certain anointings were final and irreversible, shaping how they viewed sickness, recovery, and even ordinary marital life. Incense, another imported and costly substance, was also treated as spiritual defense. It was burned to perfume the air around holy acts and holy places, and people believed its fragrance pushed away harmful presences. The smoke itself became a kind of barrier, a visible sign that the sacred zone had been established and guarded. Alongside these substances were ritual gestures that were understood almost everywhere. Breathing on a person or object was used in some rites as a command for evil to depart. The sign of the cross was even more widespread. It was made over food and drink, over the sick during worship and in moments of danger. Stories told of disasters being stopped simply by this gesture, and the message was clear. Certain actions, repeated with meaning, could shift a thing from ordinary to sacred. Because churches were publicly recognized as holy ground, they could also function as places of refuge. A person accused of a crime might flee into a church, and once inside could not be seized for execution or mutilation. Reaching sanctuary could be an anxious race, and medieval storytellers loved describing desperate escapes into sacred space. Once sheltered, the fugitive often faced a choice: Remain under protection or accept exile, leaving the kingdom forever. Sanctuary saved the body, but it could cost everything else. Not all churches offered the same level of protection. In some regions, sanctuary rites were defined in dramatic detail, with spiritual power imagined as stronger in the inner core and weaker at the edges. Some accounts describe zones around a church with escalating penalties for violence, depending on how close the crime occurred to the relics. The closer to the heart of the sacred space, the greater the outrage and the heavier the punishment. The message was that holiness was not spread evenly. It was concentrated, yet sanctuary was not untouchable in practice. There are stories where fear of holiness initially restrained pursuers, but rage eventually overcame it. In one famous account, a killer trapped inside a cathedral could not even step outside without losing protection. His enemies surrounded the building until finally a small group entered, attacked him at an altar, and cut his throat. The violation shocked observers more than the original murder, because it broke the rules that separated sacred ground from ordinary violence. Afterward, the church was treated as polluted and needed ritual cleansing. Even the architecture carried memories of refuge, like the surviving sanctuary doorknocker shaped like a beast's head, a reminder that the church once served as a shield. Holiness in medieval religious life was understood as something fragile that could be damaged and required restoration. Sacred spaces could be polluted by violence, bloodshed, or sexual transgression, and formal rituals of purification were needed to cleanse them. These rites focused on restoring purity rather than punishing guilt. A famous murder inside a cathedral showed this clearly. Worship was suspended for a long period. The church entered a symbolic state of mourning, and only after reconciliation could normal ritual life return. Ironically, the same blood that defiled the space also enhanced its fame, as martyrdom attracted devotion and spiritual power. Contamination was also associated with natural human events such as birth and death. Contact with corpses was restricted, and women after childbirth often underwent ceremonies implying purification, despite official attempts to soften such meanings. In everyday practice, childbirth was widely treated as spiritually disruptive, and poverty could even delay a woman's return to church. At the same time, holiness was not only defensive. Sacred power could be aggressive. Blessings had their opposite in curses. Stories of holy figures describe curses killing animals or ruining those who show disrespect, reinforcing the belief that spiritual authority could actively reshape reality. The strongest institutional punishment was exclusion from the Christian community. This was meant to inspire fear by cutting a person off from grace and the sacraments. Public rituals of exclusion could force rapid submission, while another powerful weapon was the suspension of worship itself. By closing churches and removing sacred symbols, bishops could shock entire communities into recognizing the spiritual consequences of political or moral conflict. Control of ritual meant control over collective security and divine favor. Religious life was structured by constant ritual. Daily worship followed a strict rhythm, and major life stages were marked by ceremonies. For most people, Sunday Mass was central, yet behavior was often casual or noisy. One reason was distance from the Eucharist. Most lay people rarely received communion, watching rather than participating. At the same time, church teaching described the Eucharist in absolute terms as the real presence of Christ, surrounded by strict rules and reinforced by miracle stories, meant to silence doubt. Preaching and confession became increasingly important. Sermons taught basic beliefs, moral duties, and the stark contrast between salvation and damnation, sometimes in the local language. By the early 13th century, confession and penance were systematized. Confession was portrayed as a powerful erasure of guilt, and priests were trained to judge sins carefully, balancing justice with social stability. Penance involved inner sorrow, spoken confession, and an outward remedy, which could range from private act to dramatic public humiliation for major offenders. Alongside confession, good works such as fasting, prayer, and almsgiving were promoted. Extreme asceticism was admired but also warned against when it became destructive. Salvation was framed practically. Failure was expected, but it had to be repaired through established rituals. Scripture shaped this world less through private reading than through images, drama, sermons, and symbols. Biblical words were also treated as protective objects, valued for their spiritual power as much as their meaning. Saints occupied a central place as living forces after death. Their relics, tombs, and shrines were believed to heal, protect, punish, and defend. Devotion to saints operated through exchange. Prayer and loyalty were expected to bring assistance, while offerings of candles and money created obligation. Miracle stories often emphasized this reciprocity, sometimes harshly. Shrines became crowded centers of devotion, wealth, and spectacle, displaying physical proof of saintly power through gifts, chains, and votive objects. Above all stood the Virgin Mary, seen as the most compassionate advocate. Her images, feasts, and prayers spread widely, and devotion to her intensified despite theological debate. Yet this expanding sacred world worried church authorities, who struggled to control unofficial cults, holy wells, and spontaneous devotion around violent deaths. Popular holiness could slip beyond supervision, forcing bishops to intervene. Pilgrimage involved heavy personal, legal, and financial risks. Long absences could leave families vulnerable, especially when property rights, inheritance, and legal authority depended on someone who might never return. Death on the road often led to disputes that surviving relatives had to resolve through the courts. Because of this, authorities sometimes required a spouse's consent before a major pilgrimage. Money was a constant concern, as travellers had to pay for ships, food, lodging, guides, and protection, and even wealthy pilgrims could be forced to borrow large sums during the journey. To make such journeys possible, pilgrims relied on shifting networks of hospitality. In places like Rome, institutions existed to support visitors from specific regions, including English pilgrims. Yet these foundations were not permanent or stable. They could fall into debt, lose their original purpose, or be absorbed into larger charitable systems. The infrastructure of pilgrimage was always changing, shaped by donations, political pressures, and the authority of those who controlled resources along the route. Accounts from early English pilgrims to the Holy Land show how exhausting these journeys were. Travel involved long sea crossings, repeated stops, and dangerous overland marches. After finally reaching Jerusalem, pilgrims often spent months moving through biblical sites. The city and its surroundings were described as a sacred landscape, where every place was tied to the life of Christ and understood as part of a living religious history. Danger was a constant companion on pilgrimage. Ships were damaged by storms, passengers drowned, and wrecked vessels left bodies along the coast. On land, travellers faced harsh terrain and the threat of robbery, while at sea they risked attacks from hostile ships. Pilgrim vessels sometimes armed themselves simply to survive. These dangers explain why a journey to Jerusalem was seen as an extraordinary achievement, requiring not only faith, but also endurance, luck, and courage. The text also reveals tensions within medieval religious life. Clergy, as a privileged and educated group, often attracted resentment from workers and rulers alike. They were criticised for enjoying leisure and preaching danger without sharing its risks. Conflicts also existed within the church, especially between secular clergy and monks. Monastic communities were sometimes accused of greed, hypocrisy, and aggressive expansion, displacing local populations to protect monastic isolation and wealth. Doubt and skepticism were present beneath the surface of religious society. Some people questioned core beliefs such as the existence of God, the afterlife, and supernatural beings. Others struggled with central rituals like the Eucharist, despite repeated warnings not to question its meaning. These warnings suggest that uncertainty was widespread enough to concern religious authorities. England at this time combined diversity with remarkable uniformity. Local customs varied widely. Measurements differed from place to place. Dialects could be hard to understand across regions, and regional prejudice was common. Yet politically, England was unusually coherent. The county system helped make this possible, creating a shared structure that connected village life to royal government. Below the county lay smaller units. Hundreds and wapentakes formed the next layer, each with its own court meeting every few weeks. Attendance was expected from local landholders. Twice a year, these courts held larger sessions focused on collective responsibility, ensuring that every free man belonged to a group accountable for its members' behaviour. This system compensated for the lack of a professional police force, making communities responsible for maintaining order. Hundreds were more easily transferred than counties. Kings often granted them to monasteries, bishops or nobles, allowing these lords to collect profits and preside over courts. Over time, many hundreds passed into private hands. Royal authority remained watchful, aware that justice and revenue could slip away if these grants went unchecked. At the lowest level stood the township. This was a corporate body with clear responsibilities. Villagers were required to provide representatives for inquiries, courts, and tax assessments. Crime reporting relied heavily on township participation. Ordinary people were drawn into the machinery of justice and administration, whether they wished it or not. This layered structure made large-scale taxation possible. When the Crown imposed taxes on property or income, the process reached deep into local society. Knights, reeves, villagers, and sworn representatives assessed wealth down to livestock, tools, and grain. Records were written, copied, and stored. Even remote communities were integrated into a national fiscal system. England, by medieval standards, was remarkably well organised. Royal finance rested on several pillars. The king was a vast landowner, drawing income from estates scattered across almost every county. Unlike rulers elsewhere in Europe, the English king possessed land throughout his realm, ensuring a physical presence of royal power everywhere. These estates were usually not managed directly. Instead, they were leased out or included in fixed payments made by sheriffs, providing predictable income with minimal administration. Royal landholding was not static. Estates were granted to reward loyalty, seized after rebellion, and reclaimed through inheritance failures. Such transfers served political purposes but reduced steady income. At the same time, confiscations and wardships brought land temporarily back into royal hands, creating opportunities for profit and patronage. Beyond land income, the crown benefited from its rights as a feudal lord. Payments were expected on inheritance, marriage, and minority. Control over the heirs of landholders could be extremely profitable. These rights were increasingly exploited, leading to growing resentment. Attempts to regulate and limit them became a central political issue. Military obligations were often converted into money payments. What began as a substitute for knight service gradually came to resemble a general land levy. Rates rose and demands became more frequent. Though not universal in theory, this system spread its burden widely in practice. Taxation went further still. England developed a land tax that applied across the kingdom, assessed through long-established fiscal units. Though rates fluctuated and exemptions existed, this tax provided a steady source of income. Later, extraordinary levies on property and income were introduced, sometimes at astonishing rates. These required intrusive assessments, drawing clergy, officials, and local representatives into close cooperation. Church structures were essential in proclaiming, organising, and enforcing these taxes. Such measures brought royal government into everyday life. Assessments recorded the possessions of peasants in minute detail. Oxen, cows, tools, and even small household items were counted and valued. The machinery of state depended on experienced local administrators who combined loyalty to the crown with knowledge of their county. These men formed the backbone of English government for generations. To the crown, with knowledge of their county, backbone of English government for sexual morality was harshly policed in theory but messy in reality. Adultery was treated as a major threat to honour, lineage and property, sometimes provoking accepted violence, while prosecution of sexual violence was often difficult and biased against vulnerable women. Religious writers condemned desire intensely, praising celibacy and virginity, but informal relationships and illegitimate children were common across society, creating conflicts between church ideals and lived experience. Social identity was displayed through the body, hair, clothing, gesture and ritual acts like kissing, and communal drinking culture often fed quarrels. In a world with weak policing and widespread weapon carrying, violence could flare from small slights. Honour functioned like a survival system. Humiliation demanded revenge, grudges lasted for years, and reconciliation required exceptional mediation or fear of divine punishment. Law mattered less than reputation, kinship, negotiation, and belief in supernatural judgment, which together shaped how conflict began, spread, and sometimes ended. In a society shaped by danger, feud, and instability, conduct guides began to define what civilized behaviour looked like for men who were neither kings nor peasants, but household rulers dependent on reputation and patronage. The ideal was not comfort or boldness, but constant self-control. Measured speech, restrained laughter, disciplined posture, and careful management of emotion. Silence was treated as protection, because attention could invite ridicule, conflict, or social damage. Public eating became a major test of character, because meals were performances watched by others. Greed, noisy chewing, careless knife handling, or visible bodily functions were signs of vulgarity and a failure of self-command. Cleanliness mattered less than discretion and dignity. Grooming, scratching, or undressing in shared spaces was shameful, because the hall was a public stage where rank was displayed and judged. Hierarchy governed behaviour down to the smallest movements: who went first, who yielded space, where the eyes looked, and how the body sat or stood. Even a stare or crossed legs could be read as arrogance. Patronage was presented as the practical framework of survival. A prudent man sought a powerful protector, offered gifts upward, and received favours downward, understanding generosity as strategy rather than pure kindness. Household authority, meanwhile, brought anxiety as well as privilege. Servants were necessary but distrusted, and masters were advised to be fair while remaining wary, because loyalty could not be assumed. Respectability, therefore, meant carrying responsibility while fearing betrayal and social exposure. Women appear in these texts largely through sexual suspicion rather than companionship. Marriage is framed as endurance and reputation management, not romance, with advice focused on hiding jealousy and avoiding public shame even when trust collapses. The good man is cautious rather than heroic, avoiding attention, masking weakness, and managing risk through discipline instead of displays of courage. Illness and healing fit the same atmosphere of fear and pragmatism. Ordinary people relied on herbs, charms, and traditional ritual remedies, while learned medicine was more theoretical and could be dangerously aggressive. Yet doctors were still sought by those who could pay. The poor often suffered visibly, left to charity at gates and roadsides. Hospitals expanded, but many offered shelter more than cure, and leper houses were built outside towns to isolate those feared as both contagious and spiritually marked. As death approached, preparation became urgent because sudden death threatened salvation by cutting off confession and repentance. Illness pushed people toward fasting, prayer, restitution, and donations, and clergy pressured the dying to surrender unjust gains. This created a tension between protecting heirs and fearing eternal punishment. A good death followed a script, arranging affairs, gathering family, accepting burial preparations, and ensuring proper rites. Burial location reflected status, most in churchyards, elites inside churches near altars, and while grave goods were discouraged, symbols of absolution and repentance could accompany the body. Bodies might be divided for practical reasons, while hearts were sometimes separated for symbolic loyalty and affection. Justice itself operated through a web of courts. Disputes might be heard at the level of the manor, the hundred, the county, or before royal judges. These courts overlapped rather than forming a clean hierarchy. Cases moved from one forum to another. Local courts handled minor matters and preserved custom. Royal courts intervened in serious disputes, especially those involving land, violence, or high-status individuals. Lords exercised authority over their own followers. This right was widely accepted and recognised by the crown. Powerful churchmen and nobles could hold courts that judged even serious crimes. Some institutions possessed sweeping judicial authority over entire regions. The king stood above them all, able to judge personally or through appointed officials who acted in his name. Legal procedure relied heavily on sworn statements. Oaths played a central role. Accusations, defences, and verdicts were bound to promises made before God. Truth was not simply established by evidence, but by invoking divine witness. Documents and testimony mattered, but spiritual commitment carried enormous weight. When oaths were not enough, cases turned to ordeals. These were tests believed to reveal divine judgment directly. Some involved physical trials, others violent combat. Battle was understood not as brute force, but as a sacred contest in which God would grant victory to the righteous. This belief gave moral meaning to violence within the courtroom. These trials were dangerous and unpredictable. Success depended on strength, skill, and luck as much as innocence. Those who lost faced disgrace, punishment, or death. Clergy and townspeople increasingly sought exemption from such methods, recognizing their cruelty and uncertainty. Alternatives slowly emerged, but ordeals remained central for much of the period. Punishment was harsh and public. Shame, mutilation, exile, and execution were all used to enforce order. Public humiliation reinforced communal norms. Severe crimes could lead to hanging, dismemberment, or burning. Authorities believed that visible suffering deterred others. Mercy was occasionally shown, but terror was an accepted tool of governance. The royal court reserved special anger for crimes that threatened royal authority. Tampering with coinage, rebellion, and treason provoked brutal responses. Kings argued that mutilation was more merciful than death, but it also served as a warning. Bodies became instruments of policy. What emerges from this system is a form of justice that was deeply entwined with power, money, belief, and fear. Courts were not neutral spaces. They were arenas where authority was displayed, negotiated, and enforced. Justice was public, physical, and spiritual at once. It shaped behaviour not only through law but through spectacle. Punishment after private accusations in medieval England could be brutal, personal, and deeply public. When a man was defeated in a private appeal, the law often allowed the accuser to carry out the sentence himself. Justice was not only declared in court, it was enacted by the very hands of those who had brought the charge. A striking example comes from the early 13th century. A man named Thomas from a village in western England was defeated in trial by combat after being accused of violent assault. By custom, such a defeat could have led directly to execution. Yet the royal judges chose what they described as mercy. Instead of death, they ordered mutilation. They instructed the victor's relatives to enforce the punishment. What followed was savage. The sentence was carried out with enthusiasm, driven less by justice than by vengeance. The scene turned into a spectacle of cruelty that shocked even contemporaries. Personal resentment and past relationships only deepened the violence. The law had spoken, but it was human rage that completed the act. Such punishments rarely occurred in silence. Although truthfulness and balance were often praised as ideals, audiences also craved grand origin stories. A hugely successful legendary history of Britain, full of heroic kings and Arthurian greatness, spread rapidly despite criticism that it was invented. It proved that medieval readers wanted not only accuracy but also an emotionally powerful past filled with epic meaning and unforgettable heroes. Time in medieval life was structured less by clocks than by the sky, and by sacred custom. Days followed sunlight, months followed the moon, and the week an inherited human rhythm organised work and worship. Hours were often variable, stretching in summer and shrinking in winter, and monasteries used sundials or water clocks to keep prayer schedules. Even the start of the day and the start of the year could vary by tradition, which helps explain why medieval dating can look inconsistent. Meals, rest, and prayer created the basic rhythm of daily life, with the main meal commonly in early to mid-afternoon. The religious week carried strong moral weight: Friday fasting, Saturday Marian devotion, and Sunday as protected sacred time. Church leaders tried to curb Sunday markets and labour, using threats, sermons, and miracle stories about divine punishments, but resistance was strong, especially when royal government defended markets for revenue and control. The struggle over Sunday observance became a long campaign to reshape social time. The year was governed by both agricultural seasons and the Christian feast cycle, with many dates expressed through saints' days rather than numbers. Moving feasts, especially Easter, shifted the entire liturgical calendar, and different conventions for the new year produced conflicting year labels for the same event. Festivals helped people endure hardship and mark abundance, while Lent imposed discipline and Easter brought release. Rents, payments, and obligations were often tied to sacred dates, blending economic life into religious timekeeping. Alongside this structured time ran a deep hunger to predict the future. People read meaning into dreams, omens, bodily signs, and chance events, and they consulted diviners, palm readers, and especially astrologers as new learning spread from the Islamic world. Astrology became influential even among bishops and political elites, though critics worried it threatened human freedom. In politics, prophecy thrived because uncertainty around kings, war, and succession was unbearable, and unofficial prediction filled gaps that official religion could not satisfy. A famous case shows how prophecy resisted disproof. A visionary predicted the end of a king's reign on a particular holy day. The king publicly outlasted the deadline, and believers simply reinterpreted the meaning, shifting dates, or claiming the prophecy was symbolic. Prophecy spread through rumour and writing, and once a prophet gained fame, new predictions were attached to his name whether he had spoken them or not. Texts that used vivid but vague animal symbolism became especially powerful because they could be applied to different people in different crises and seem accurate through flexible interpretation. Beyond political prophecy lay cosmic expectation. Many believed the world was old and moving toward an ending, imagining dramatic final day disasters and debates about when the last enemy would appear and from where. Some writers urged reform and repentance, convinced that the restraining force against evil had weakened. In medieval England, two futures coexisted. One focused on dynasties and sudden reversals, the other on the ultimate end of history itself. In both, prophecy offered a human comfort, turning fear into narrative and uncertainty into something that felt interpretable.